Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the outcomes of the Civil War and Reconstruction. As you guys can tell, I don't have my voice very well, so I'm going to do my best to keep this short. It's not a very long video. So the Civil War is over now, and Reconstruction's over, so we're just going to talk about what life was like for some people after the Civil War and Reconstruction. First off, one thing that happened is the political effects. And following the end of Reconstruction, former Confederates regained political power in the South. And this led to the beginning of Jim Crow laws and black code. So they had a lot of things where only whites can go, and then only colored, which would be black people, can go. And remember, the Confederate leaders didn't go to jail. They were pardoned, which means they were forgiven. So since they didn't go to jail and they just went back to the South, they were able to get positions like governors, senators, congressmen. They were elected by the people in the South back into power. And remember, African Americans were slaves, and just because they were free now, a lot of the white people still didn't like them. There was a lot of racism. So we're going to talk more about Jim Crow laws and black codes. And the time period of Jim Crow and black codes were laws in the South that limited the civil liberties of African Americans in the South. So the big thing is blacks were not treated fairly in the South. Here are some examples. White people, like, they had a nice water fountain, but they just said colored. That was black people. Really anyone who wasn't white had to use this water fountain, which isn't as good. A lot of companies only would help white people, and it wasn't just blacks that were targeted. Really, if you were not white in lots of areas, like this sign right here is from Texas, and this says we serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexicans. So in the South, it was really only white people were treated fairly. And next, we're going to talk about the economic impacts. And the southern states were left devastated by the war. Farms, railroads, and factories had been destroyed throughout the South. Remember, the South, which is the Confederacy, they left the United States, so the Union went in, and all the fighting pretty much took place in the South. So that's why their farms, their railroads, their factories were destroyed. And since the Confederacy, they started their own country, they had their own money, but Confederate money was worthless. So a lot of people in the South who had Confederate money, they couldn't do anything with it. It was literally worth nothing. And many towns and cities were destroyed. In particular, the cities of Richmond and Atlanta were destroyed. So Richmond and Atlanta are two of the biggest cities in the South, and they were completely destroyed after the war. And the source of labor was greatly changed due to the loss of life during the war and to slavery. So a lot of Southerners fighting the war died, so they had no one to work the farms. And there wasn't slavery anymore, so they couldn't have free labor. They had to start paying for their labor. And the South would remain an agriculture-based economy and the poorest section of the country for many decades afterwards. So they continued to have farming after the war, but the South was by far the poorest part of the country. So the North made a lot of money, a lot of people went west and made money, but the South was poor. This is some examples of the South. You can see this is from, I believe, is from Atlanta. You can see the whole city was destroyed. All their railroads were destroyed. It costed a lot of money to repair. Here is some factory that was destroyed. And this was Confederate money, but remember, it's worthless now. So if you had 50 Confederate dollars, you couldn't do anything with it. Nobody wanted it. But what happened is the North and the Midwest emerged with strong and growing industrial economies. And industrial, I mean, that's like a factory. That's where people work. They're making stuff. That's where cities are. Cities are where there's industrial economies because a lot of people work there. And this laid the foundation for the sweeping industrialization of the nation. And almost the whole entire nation started industrializing except the South, which they're poor and they're farming still. And in the next half century, and the emergence of the United States as a global economic power by the beginning of the 20th century. So up until this point, the U.S. was doing pretty well, but it really wasn't that great before the Civil War. It wasn't that great during the war. But after the Civil War, the United States became one of the wealthiest countries in the world. I mean, even today, we're still one of the wealthiest. A lot of people try to move to the United States because we have a lot of money, we have a lot of jobs, and that started with our industrial economies. And there's still a lot of discrimination and segregation of African Americans after the war. We talked about it with the Jim Crow laws and black codes, but these laws limited freedoms for African Americans. And after Reconstruction, many southern state governments passed Jim Crow laws forcing separation of races in public places. So once again, that's just blacks and whites cannot be at the same place. And there was a lot of intimidation and crimes were directed against African Americans, and a lot of African Americans were killed by whites by lynching in the South. And that's where you hang someone with a rope around the neck. So that happened a lot in the South, unfortunately. And yeah, and a lot of white people, they almost were never arrested for it. And what happened is African Americans looked to the courts to safeguard, which means to protect their rights. So they tried going to judges, they tried suing people to try to get more rights. However, it didn't go over very well because eventually someone sued, this guy named Plessy sued a guy named Ferguson, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, which is like the highest judge in the nation, whatever they say, the whole country has to follow. They ruled that separate but equal did not violate the 14th Amendment, upholding Jim Crow laws of the air. So essentially the Supreme Court said, oh, you can have white people in one area and black people in another, that's fine. And they just said it had to be equal. However, although it said separate but equal, things were not equal. You guys saw the pictures of what a white water fountain looked like compared to a black water fountain. Things were not equal for everybody. And during the early 20th century, African Americans began the Great Migration to northern cities in search of jobs and to escape poverty. So a lot of African Americans in the South, they couldn't find jobs. They couldn't get work. White people didn't want to pay them very much. They were very poor, and they were discriminated against. You guys saw the illegal, or not illegal, but all the ways that whites made it difficult for them to vote. They couldn't use the same facilities, so they left to northern cities. And what happened is African Americans eventually found that the North was similar to the South when it came to racial attitude and its use of subtle ways to enforce the separation of the races. So the North was not as bad as the South, but it was similar. A lot of people in the North still did not treat African Americans fairly. And one thing, whenever you see something the 20th century, the 20th century means the 19th century. So we're talking about the early 1900s for when this happened, like 1901, 1902, 1910, 1920. That's when the 20th century was. All right, if you guys have any questions, let me know. And that's it for today.